thousands of people in need of emergency assistance 2 months after Hurricane Irma.
Thousands line up for a second day now in hopes of getting the relief they need.
Organizers and recipients say the long lines are evidence of how Hurricane Irma impacted lives and cost people money.
Houston underwater. Cars and trucks stranded on miles of flooded roads.
They're already losing ice. They're already beginning that process of collapse. It's already contributing to sea level rise, decades ahead of schedule.
For way too long, the politicians and the people in power have gotten away with not doing anything to fight the climate crisis. But we will make sure that they will not get away with it any longer.
Our education won't be important if we don't have a life to live for anymore.
California tonight is home to a record-shattering heat wave and about 24 wildfires currently burning across the state.
4 million acres have burned so far.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Well, I don't think science knows, actually.
What's happening in the Amazon today is something that's actually been going on for some time, but never on this scale. Forest fires have been raging and multiplying across the great Amazon basin.
No generation has had an awareness of what goes on worldwide in every part of the globe, from the tops of the mountains to the bottom of the seas, than we have. We have no excuse for not knowing what we're doing to the natural world.
Hi everyone, I'm Carolyn Kormann, a staff writer at The New Yorker, and on behalf of the magazine, thank you for joining this year's very first virtual festival and today's discussion on the climate crisis, featuring Jonathan Franzen, Betsy Kolbert, and Bill McKibben. Before we get going, a couple quick things. First, feel free to post on social media, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, and the hashtag is New Yorker Fest. And also, towards the end of the event, we will be taking questions from you. So anytime between now and then, it will be the last 15 minutes. Please submit a question using the form on the festival website. And if you're tuning in from YouTube or on YouTube, the link is in the description. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce, it's my great privilege really to introduce these panelists. First, we have Jonathan Franzen, who is a frequent contributor. Hi, John. A frequent contributor to The New Yorker, the author of 5 novels, including Purity, The Corrections, and Freedom, and 5 works of nonfiction and translation, including the Kraus Project, and most recently, The End of the Earth. John has received a National Book Award for fiction and the EuroNatur Prize for his work on conservation. Next, we have Betsy Kolbert, who has been, hi Betsy, she's been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1999. The Climate of Man, her 3-part magazine series on global warming, garnered a National Magazine Award for public interest, and her books include The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History, which won the Pulitzer Prize. She's also has a new book coming out next year, Under a White Sky, and she's received another National Magazine Award for her reviews and criticism, the Blake Dodd Prize, and the Heinz Award. And last but not least, we have Bill McKibben, who is also a frequent contributor or contributing writer for The New Yorker and the author of the publication's weekly climate crisis newsletter. Bill founded the international grassroots organization 350.org, and he also serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College. And among his many honors, or the many honors he's received, are the Right Livelihood Award, which has also been called an alternative Nobel Prize, and the Gandhi Peace Award. His most recent book, Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out, was released last year. Okay, so let's get going. I wanted to first discuss with the three of you how we got here. And I thought I'd ask each of you to kind of back up and describe when or where you first learned about climate change and what drew you to the subject. And Bill, I thought maybe you could start, since you wrote the first book on climate change for The End of Nature is the title for a general audience, I think 30 years ago. So yeah, if you could get us going.
Absolutely. First of all, Carolyn, what a pleasure to get to you. You didn't really introduce yourself, but you've been writing remarkable stuff on this and other topics for the New Yorker for a while now, and we're really grateful for it. It was at the New Yorker that I started to really think about all this stuff. I wrote a long piece for the magazine about where everything in my apartment came from. Spent a year, following the water lines up into the Catskills and going to Brazil to look at where Con Ed was buying oil, and on and on and on and on. And by the end of it, I had managed to understand in a way I hadn't before that the human arrangements on the Earth were somewhat more vulnerable and fragile than I had thought. I'd really never paid them much attention at all. And so in the next year or two, 1986, 87, 88, when I was reading the very early science on climate change and starting to think about it, reading the journals and things, I think it struck me harder than it otherwise would have, just this sense that we were buying ourselves a great deal of trouble. And at first, I got to say my interest was largely journalistic. I thought this was the great story, was going to turn out to be the great story of all time, and I couldn't understand why everybody wasn't interested in covering it. But about halfway through writing The End of Nature, I was 27 or 28, I guess, when I was writing it. It really became clear to me that I was not objective in any of the senses that I was used to thinking of myself as a good reporter. I did not want the world to heat up and blow away. And so I guess ever since then, I've been some mix of trying to describe the problem and trying to do something about it.
Okay, Betsy, I think when The End of Nature came out, you were reporting for the Times in Albany, but I guess Albany politics weren't depressing enough for you.
Yes, I mean, I was one of those people who first heard about climate change. Really, the very first time I remember even being conscious of it was the summer of 1988, which was a really hot summer and was the moment when Jim Hansen went to Capitol Hill, and it was a very famous set of hearings. And I think many Americans probably became aware of climate change that summer. And then I was also one of those people who was really educated about climate change by Bill. First in the New Yorker, when I don't know if all of The End of Nature appeared in the New Yorker, Bill, or just a big chunk of it. And then when the book came out, I have my first edition of The End of Nature. And it really, made a very big impression on me. But I was a political reporter at the time in Albany for the New York Times. And eventually I came to the New Yorker. And that was sort of a time when Bill was elsewhere. And no one was really writing about this issue at the New Yorker. And for a whole series of reasons, even though I had sort of been hired at the magazine to cover politics, I ended up wanting to solve, really for my own sake, this was around the early 2000s, to answer the question, was this really the biggest story in the world or not? And finding, unfortunately, that it was, and also finding myself, sort of captured by the sheer significance of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And John, I think your book, your novel, The Corrections, came out about a week or two before or around the time that Betsy's first story on climate for the New Yorker appeared. It was in September 2001. And in that novel, you did write about climate change some. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that decision to include climate change as a theme or subject in the book.
Thank you, Carolyn, for doing this. I think you have the hardest job by far of the three of us, and it's I commend you for that. The scene and the corrections where I do touch on climate change came out of an experience I'd had in 1992. Like Betsy, I'd kind of first become aware of the problem in that hot summer of 1988 in New York. It really was hot. But then in 1992, I was at a conference center as a writer, but most of the other people were academics. And there were these two dear plant scientists who were working on trying to design a better chlorophyll model that could function better in arid places. And they spent the first 20 minutes of their talk telling a history of carbon on the planet. And basically plants come along, they grow huge, they fall on the ground. And plant development apparently advanced faster than fungal and microbial development. So instead of decaying on the ground, those dead plants got buried. And that happened for whatever, 50 million, 100 million years. So, and the climate got cooler because so much carbon had been sucked out of the air. And then they fast forwarded to the present age when a very clever animal came along and began digging up all that carbon and putting it back in the air. It was a very bleak talk, but it had a punchline, which was, don't recycle plastic, bury the carbon underground. And the combination of this was not their field. They were not climate scientists, but they were clearly thinking about it, and they were actually trying to do something about it. Like, plants are giving away too much water vapor because the chlorophyll isn't efficient. So that's really where it fully flashed on my radar.
Wow. Bill, I remember meeting you for the first time in 2007 in Vermont, and you described how some Middlebury undergrads you knew, maybe you were advising them or you knew them from being a scholar there, that they wanted to form some kind of grassroots organization. They wanted to get, and you felt it was time to move into the streets. And I guess I wanted to ask why you decided to move into activism, and if it was a hard decision after you had been, a reporter all those years already, and what that was like, what led to that decision at that moment.
Well, I think what led to it, Carolyn, was that I'd done a bad job of analyzing the problem here. I think when I wrote The End of Nature, and in my defense, I was 28 or something, so a little naivete is, I guess, okay. I didn't really understand how anything worked. And, well, my theory was we were in an argument about climate change, and if we wrote enough books and had enough papers and symposiums and speeches and things, the level of evidence would be so great that eventually, before too long, our leaders would begin to lead on this, because why wouldn't they? It clearly had to be done. This was the biggest problem we'd ever come up against. And it took me a good decade, I'd say, right through the Kyoto stuff, before I really began to understand that I had analyzed it incorrectly. We'd long since won the argument. By 1995 at the latest, when the IPCC declared quite forthrightly what was going on, the argument was over. We'd won the argument. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about data and reason. It was what fights are always about, money and power. And the other side here, the fossil fuel industry, had plenty of both. So, my reading of history was the only way that on occasion people are able to challenge that kind of power is by building movements. And so that's what we started trying to do. 350.org, which I did found with 7 Middlebury undergraduates, and exploded pretty rapidly because there was a kind of unfilled ecological niche. Within a year or so, we'd had the first big day of global climate action. We had 5,200 rallies in 181 countries simultaneously. But most of them were small, 100 people here, 200 there. And it's been the great work and delight of the last decade to watch so many people come and do this work, to watch Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, Fridays for the Future, and the school strikers around the world. You know about Greta Thunberg, who's wonderful, but there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs all over the planet. So it's been really a pleasure to watch that movement build, and now to reach the point, I think, where it's beginning to really show itself capable of challenging the power of what was, but is no longer, the most powerful industry on the planet.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the fossil fuel industry's cover-up and misinformation campaign, and kind of open it up, and or go to you, Betsy, just as, you know, what role has that played, and in this crisis, and why has it been so powerful?
Well, I think what the fossil fuel, companies recognized really early on was that all they really needed to do, and great whole books, entire books, and very good books, The Merchants of Debt, for example, by Naomi Oreskes, is a very good analysis of this. They realized that all they needed to do was sow doubt. They didn't even really need to disprove anything, and disproving it was pretty much impossible. The geophysics, as I was told early on in my own reporting on climate change, the physics are impeccable. There's just no arguing with them. But they needed to throw up, to use a bad pun, they needed to throw up a certain amount of smoke, and that would be sufficient to delay action for quite a long time. And unfortunately, we've seen that. And they were, I do want to say also, they were sort of pushing on an open door, especially in the US, where people don't particularly, and still don't, I'm going to say, really want to change the way we live, which is very, very fossil fuel intensive. So if we really want to take this problem seriously, which, Lord knows I hope and pray that we do, there are a lot of changes that have to be made. They're pretty fundamental to the way we live, the way we do business, where we live even. And these are big, big issues that are hard to tackle politically. And so if you also, right now, by the now, we've gotten to the situation where, unfortunately, one party, and I don't think this is a wildly controversial thing to say, is almost a wholly owned subsidiary. One party has become the repository of a lot of campaign contributions. So we're having this fight to the death, and I hope, in a couple of weeks, we're going to see one chapter of that. Maybe close, maybe not. I guess we're going to find out.
Mm-hmm. I definitely want to get to talking about the stakes of the election. But in terms of kind of where we are now in the climate crisis and the impacts we're seeing, I wanted to mention that how scientists drew a line in the sand years ago and said that to prevent catastrophe, the worst scenario, we needed to limit planetary warming to 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And I wonder, do any of you think that's possible at this point?
I don't.
It's certainly possible. I think if you took a poll of climate scientists, they would say it's not bloody likely, but physically it's certainly possible at this point still.
It's physically possible, yes. I stand corrected. It's just very unlikely. I actually liked Betsy's phrase, pushing on an open door, because while it is easy to create a system in which the world has been victimized by a few well-funded corporations that make a lot of political contributions, the fact is, as Betsy said, Americans don't really want to change. And in a way, all of the smoke and the denialism was really just cover, in the same way that after 1964, everyone knew that smoking caused cancer, but people kept smoking. And, some of the real diehard people, if pressed, might say, oh, well, there are scientists who say that the science is wrong. But that's not really the issue. The issue is people didn't want to quit. And for me, a second moment of enlightenment was maybe 6 years ago. I read Dale Jamison's book, Reason in a Dark Time, which had the very contentious subtitle, Why the Fight Against Climate Change Failed, past tense. And in it, he lays out a different political story than one simply of a nation deceived by well-funded denialists, and kind of lays out the psychological and also politically self-interest reasons that people don't want to take the incredibly drastic steps that would be required to slam on the brakes and fly into reverse in terms of our carbon emissions. And that's really, when I say I think it's extremely unlikely that we will get there with the 2-degree goal, it has to do with human nature and it has to do with political realities.
Well, the good news is that it's actually probably not. We probably can take a fair number of these steps without having to violate anything very deep in human nature. I mean, the engineers have done a good job over the last decade, and renewable energy is no longer the alternative. It's now the cheapest way to do all this. So it probably is not beyond us to do what people in a number of other countries have now managed to do, and dramatically increase the level of energy that's coming from the sun and the wind, nor probably beyond us to figure out how to use that electricity for a lot more things than we're doing at the moment. It was an interesting sign when California, headquarters of world car culture, announced recently that the internal combustion engine was on the way out in fairly short order. None of this is happening fast enough, and everyone's right. We may well not be able to stop at 2 degrees. We better start jamming on the brakes as fast as we can now, because if we don't, we're going to be at 3 or 4 degrees Celsius increase. And if we do that, then we're not going to have civilizations like the ones we're used to having, which would be an enormous shame, since at this point, I think the changes needed to at least get started are far from impossible, really not even all that daunting unless you own an oil well or a coal mine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a common journalistic rejoinder is don't we know all this already in terms of climate science, in terms of the need for rapid acceleration of renewable infrastructure, and at the same time, many of the challenges that scientists projected are happening. Many of the changes, climate impacts are happening faster than scientists projected. I guess, Betsy, could you speak about the lag in climate science, just from a journalistic perspective, a writer's perspective, how that is a difficult thing to get across to the public and make them then want to act?
Well, I think one of the really, daunting challenges of climate change, and it's, haunted me as a journalist for, almost 2 decades now, when I first really went out to try to write a story about climate change, which was in the early 2000s, it was actually quite difficult to find places where you could go where scientists would say, okay, this is clearly a climate change impact. Now, unfortunately, that's not difficult at all. Every day we turn on the news and find more evidence. This is clearly, if not, a wholly caused by climate change, certainly exacerbated by climate change. And that's true of the hurricane that's, slamming Louisiana right now. So, but the problem is that there's a lot of inertia in the climate system. There's a big time lag. So the effects that we're seeing were caused, by this sort of generation ago emissions, and the effects that we're already, in a sense, locking in, that's happening right now, is extremely difficult to change that, what's going to happen, next year, the year after that. So we are trying to make changes for bend that curve, but we won't see the impacts of having bent that curve, really for the lifetimes of those of us, sitting here on this panel today. That's a very daunting message. It makes the imperative to do something that much stronger, but also the difficulty of it that much harder, because you're trying to stop a train that has a lot of momentum behind it. And I think that one of the reasons that climate scientists, 30 years ago, when Jim Hansen went to Capitol Hill, and when it was quite difficult, as I said, at that moment in 1988, to point to things and say that is climate change, because there's a lot of variability in the natural climate systems. They were trying to raise this alarm precisely because they knew at the point where you see the climate that you don't like, which may be right about now, a lot of people waking up and saying, we don't like this climate. This is not what we want. Perpetual fires in the Southwest and on the West Coast, perpetual, hurricanes that very rapidly intensify over a warming Gulf of Mexico. We decided we really don't like this. There's no button you can push and say stop at that point. There's just too much inertia in the system. So that is the really hard, both set of concepts to get across to people and also political realities to deal with.
Yeah, we're designed, or all of our local governments plan for a future based on a past climate, and that has a lot to do with adaptation. I guess I wanted to ask each of you, what are some of the worst climate change impacts you've witnessed firsthand? I mean, talking about impacts now, and we're seeing it now. It's well underway. And maybe John, you could help. You live in Santa Cruz, California, so I wondered if you could tell us what you saw this in the past few months.
Well, we saw. I was driving up from Southern California in mid-August, and it started raining, which, like in the Central Valley in mid-August, just doesn't happen. And 2 nights later, sure enough, there was this tremendous series of thunderstorms all across Northern California, dry lightning, touched off several hundred wildfires, many of which immediately got out of control, including one just a couple miles from where I live. Scary times here. More than 1,000 people lost homes just in the immediate neighborhood here. And it was clear this kind of lightning storm was probably driven by the additional amount of energy that is in the atmospheric system. This was freak. No one could remember such a thing happening. And we will be seeing many, many more supposedly freak events, because there's just so much energy in the system. In terms of messaging, though, Gavin Newsom did come out in the wake of 4 million acres burned and said, okay, that's it. After 2035, no more gasoline-powered cars can be sold new in California. But really, I wished he would have come out. He did also say we need better fire management. But this is where the messaging and the politics get very tricky, because our president, Donald Trump, who couldn't tell the federal government from Santa Cruz City Council, says it's because we've allowed too much fuel to build up in the forests. Well, he's right. Of course, he blames it on California. It's mostly federal land. But you have to kind of keep away from that, because that is actually what's driving a lot of the intensity of the fire, and the number of fires. Is that a century of fire suppression has created this enormous fuel load at ground level. There are things you can do about it. There are better ways to do controlled burns. It would take a massive investment. But it seems to me that if you jump straight to 2035, you're ignoring what needs to be done right now. You need to do better fire management. You need to change the insurance regime so that fewer people are living in these urban wildland interfaces. And I think, as if the problem of communication wasn't already hard enough, now we need to be saying, you know what, we're already there. We're entering that bad time. And let's be honest about that, because not only do we need to be looking 25 years down the line, we need to be looking right now about making serious preparations for what we know is coming.
Absolutely. Bill or Betsy, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would just say to go back to your original question of sort of the thing always to remember for me about climate change is that the iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and harder you suffer. And it's true that California is going through a lot. It's also true that California, in relative terms, is rich enough and has some resilience. I remember for me, the moment I think that really drove things home was in the early 2000s. I was doing some reporting in Bangladesh, and which obviously is going to be hit very hard chronically by climate change. You know, the sea level is rising and already forcing millions of people out of coastal farms. You know, the eventual melt of the glaciers of the Himalaya will shut down the operation of the Brahmaputra and the whole delta there in the Bay of Bengal. But when I was there, they were having an acute problem. Their first big outbreak of a disease called dengue fever that the WHO says will be the emergent disease of this century has spread remarkably fast because, as the mosquito that likes it really likes the warm, wet world we're creating for it. And I remember, I spent a lot of time in the slums, so eventually I got bit by the wrong mosquito myself, and I was as sick as I've ever been. But I remember being at this sort of vast clinic in downtown Dhaka with people just lying on cots in big rows stretching off to the distance, and just remembering thinking, man, is this unfair? Like even today, if you go look at the league tables of carbon production, Bangladesh with a couple of 100 million people is essentially a rounding error. And that was one of the things I think that really convinced me that the time had come to try and be active as can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the environmental movement and the scientific community has been overwhelmingly white for a long time, and that's finally starting to change a little bit. But even look at this panel, and so I wanted to discuss some of the ways in which this lack of diversity has hampered the movement and hampered change and and made things worse. And maybe Betsy, you could, I guess, guide us a little bit through what who will be more than ever. I mean, you've written so much brilliantly about global extinction and I guess looking ahead at worst case scenarios, who will be more than ever affected by the climate crisis, and as natural resources are increasingly commodified, what will that mean?
Well, I mean, I think that what Bill said is absolutely correct, and there is tragically this inverse proportionality between how much you contributed to the problem and how likely what order in which you're going to get socked by it. And obviously people who are living close to the edge, people who are subsistence farmers right now, who a slight change in monsoon patterns and rainfall patterns can really push people immediately over the edge. And we are seeing that in various parts of the world, even as we speak. So that is a part of a very cruel, one of the many cruel aspects of climate change. And it really makes the imperative for a country like the US, and once again, what's so really despicable about what is going on now and really has been going on in different gradations, really once again, since the first reports on climate change were delivered to the federal government in the 1960s. You can go back and read them, and they had all the information that you really needed, is that the US is significantly, by far, the biggest aggregate contributor to the problem, and we are sticking our fingers in our ears and saying, la, 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 we don't want to hear about it. And that's just unconscionable and unacceptable, obviously, on a geopolitical level, and I think has really contributed to our declining standing in the world. Donald Trump's announcement that he's going to withdraw from Paris, which probably a lot of Americans didn't, it was just a little fly buzz, but it really, I think, made the international community take notice, and a very, very painstakingly worked out treaty that, had many problems with it. We could discuss that. It's probably not worth going into right now, but it represented a good faith effort, I think, to move forward, to acknowledge this was a problem, to acknowledge that there was a tremendous responsibility from the developed world toward the developing world that we have not lived up to at all. So that's a huge part of the issue. Now, then, if you look at, sort of internally in the US, where, as you say, the environmental movement has tended to be very white, sort of affluent people who, not reflective of the diversity of the U.S. I do think that is changing, and actually, when you do polls, it consistently comes out that many groups in the U.S. are actually, very concerned about climate change, even if they're not, as well represented right now on the sort of boards of environmental groups. And there is this huge, intersection of a lot of different issues of where we put projects that we don't want. All of those issues of environmental justice, I think, are coming to the fore right now. Now, the question of how we sort of move forward, I think there's a lot of people making the point, and I think it's a very legitimate point, that you're not going to solve one of these problems alone. You're going to have to solve them simultaneously. That's a very, very tall order, though, I also want to say. And so, are we going to move forward and try to solve all these problems simultaneously, or are we going to move backwards and try to ignore them all simultaneously? And unfortunately, right now, I can't quite give you the answer to that. I think I do want to just also allude to the point that Bill made that, some of these problems have gotten easier to deal with because the cost of solar and the cost of wind have come way down. So we are having a different conversation than we would have had, 10 years ago. The value of oil companies has plunged. But, unfortunately, the fact remains that we still get the vast proportion of our primary energy in this country from fossil fuels. And we in the US are a big fossil fuel producer right now. That has changed too. That changed during the Obama administration. We really became once again a big producer of fossil fuels. And so there are, unfortunately, once again, a huge entrenched interests in favor of keeping us producing fossil fuels. So these are all tremendous issues and tremendous fights that are going to be waged over the next generation. I don't know how they're going to turn out.
Yeah, I think that's a good chance to bring up, or draw all of you out on the stakes of the upcoming election. I mean, we saw in the clip at the start of the video, at the start of the event, Trump saying that the Earth will start getting cooler. You just watch. And when challenged on that, he said, "I don't think science knows." So yeah, anyone can jump in here. What are the stakes ahead for this election?
Well, I'll let you. I'll just say they couldn't be higher. They couldn't be higher. I mean, we are either at an inflection point or not.
Yeah, I guess if Biden and Kamala Harris win, what are a few of the things they can immediately do, and kind of just to stave off catastrophe, and give us some hope.
Well, I think Biden has promised to take us right back into the Paris Accord, assuming they will still have us. And there are elements of whatever Biden version of the Green New Deal might be that are very commendable, things we should all aspire to, particularly a more just and humane nation. That seems to have kind of fallen by the wayside for the last 4 years. I would personally hope that if there is going to be a massive investment, that it be done judiciously and not simply with a view to job creation, because there are many ways to create jobs. For instance, I think about the high-speed train line that California wants to build between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And great idea, be great if we had one, but a couple tens of billions of dollars to do that at a time when, first of all, as Bill pointed out, people in other countries are taking it even worse than people in California are going to take it. But also that there are things we should be doing to build resilience, given that the effect on the temperature in 2060 of a high-speed train line between Los Angeles and San Francisco is essentially zero. It will have no effect on what the temperature does, given the momentum of events and also given the relatively tiny dent it would make in carbon emissions. So I think just first of all, having a more humane society where people are kind to each other and take care of each other, that's a huge step forward. We need that. That's part of resilience. That's part of social resilience. And we've had 4 years of the opposite of that. And then beyond that, yeah, let's get realistic and let's try to do the best. Sorry, that got kind of stupid at the end, but
no, I mean, I think you've written a lot about. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say, kindness is a good idea, and I think there's also a ton of very straightforward. There's a huge amount of kind of pent-up work that we haven't been doing that we now know how to do, and we're beginning to see places take this on. So, for instance, here are some of the things that are going to happen fairly quickly, would be my guess. Real moves to stop putting in new, buildings are a big part of our problem. So in New York City and in a couple of other cities around the country, they've now mandated dramatic changes in efficiency for building operation, for big buildings. And that's going to be going to smaller buildings and homes as well. And the trick here is not that we have a technological problem. Things like air source heat pumps and induction cooktops are easily able to replace the appliances that heat and cook and things at the moment. It's that we need a certain amount of financing to kind of prime the pump and get this transition underway. And I think that's one of the things that the Green New Deal, some of the parts of it really envision. The same kind of things are going to be happening in transportation, and as we move towards a more electrified country, and the same sort of things are going to be happening on a larger scale with the production of primary energy, as we're really poised to figure out how to ramp up, not on a shallow ramp, but a steep one, the production of clean energy. Part of that work's going to be done by Biden and the Senate, hopefully, and so on and so forth. But the other place that people need to keep pressuring, the other place that matters here is the financial system. In some ways, it's more important because Wall Street probably, for better or mostly worse, rules more of the world than Washington does, and also because it operates somewhat more quickly. So the pressure that we've been putting on over the last couple of years as a movement, the BlackRocks and the Chase Banks of the world, the huge divestment campaign that's now at about $15 trillion and really pressuring the investment community to act differently. These things are beginning to really tell as well. So I think some of the groundwork now is laid for quicker action. But on top of that, we're definitely going to need a new kind of ethic of solidarity that will allow us to deal with what's coming. And, we should be able to begin sort of seeing how that works after the year we've just come through. George Floyd said the most important thing of 2020, I can't breathe. People can't breathe for lots of reasons. There's a cop kneeling on their neck. There's a coal-fired power plant down the street, and it's always in the same communities. The wildfire smoke's gotten so bad that people have told them to go, tape your windows shut and stay indoors. It's gotten so damn hot that it just is stifling. So that kind of solidarity, that kind of understanding that we've finally reached a problem that we are all in together, that's going to be important for us to understand and act on.
Yes, absolutely. And children from all sorts of backgrounds have shown themselves to be pretty much the greatest climate leaders we've ever seen. And I think I wanted to ask, before we move into questions from the audience, if you think the Fridays for Future movement and other youth movements can sustain their momentum as we are still fighting our way to the end of this pandemic.
I personally am more excited about Extinction Rebellion, but it's great. And this is, I mean, people who are 15 today are in the same position as people in Bangladesh. We've exported our own consumption and the results of that onto not only people in less privileged places, but also to an entire less privileged generation, and they're understandably angry, and I think that is a great political resource.
Well, okay. So let's take some questions from all of you watching all around the world, I guess, I hope. First question comes from Paula. Why has the needle not shifted on greenhouse gas emissions since the IPCC report was published in 2018, despite protests, marches, and a bright spotlight being shone on the problem?
Well,
it's a hard needle to shift.
Yeah.
Go on, Bill. Betsy.
No, I think, I mean, you know, why hasn't it shifted? It's shifted in the wrong direction. I mean, you know, until the pandemic hit, we were looking at, you know, annual increases pretty much every year. And, you know, there are a lot of reasons for that. And part of it has to do with, in fact, you know, emissions in the US have been pretty flat, you know, even under Donald Trump, despite his, you know, best and most misguided efforts to goose them up again. Emissions in the US actually, you know, declined slightly, I think, in 2019. But, you know, there's this, not only is there massive inertia in the climate system, there's massive inertia in building out energy systems. So there's a lot of parts of the world where people don't have electricity. You know, many, you know, hundreds of millions of people don't have electricity. And for example, India, which gets a lot of its power still, I think this is shifting somewhat now, but it's getting most of it, the vast majority of its electricity at this point from coal. And there's a lot of inertia in that. And who are we really, even in the US, to say that that shouldn't be? That's how we got our electricity for, you know, many generations. So these are inertial systems, and this really gets back to, you know, the question that you asked before about, are we going to manage to avoid 2 degrees? That requires stepping on the brakes really fast in a system that both, you know, that politically, geophysically, and in terms of sheer infrastructure build out, has a tremendous amount of inertia. So things that are possible, physically possible. I mean, one of the big things that we're going to face going forward, I can just give you a preview, if we turn this, you know, proverbial corner and decide, okay, we really do want to do something about climate change, we are now going to face new siting problems. How do you site all these problems, your projects? Alternative energy projects. People don't like even having windmills. I know, you know, Bill is up in Vermont. There are huge fights over putting windmills on ridges in Vermont even. So you're going to have, you know, the sheer speed with which you have to cite things. One of the things the Biden administration is going to have to deal with is, are you going to try to streamline certain siting projects so that you can get alternative energy projects going a lot faster than they would under the current set of regulations?
Thanks. Thank you. We have a question from Paul Chapman. He writes, as you, each of you, write about science, the environment, and climate change, and you are all constantly describing the impending existential crisis we face. How do you maintain your personal equilibrium and sense of hope given the work you do?
Well, I've advocated a balanced portfolio of hopes. Obviously, you can hope that there will be a miracle technological fix to climate change. Someone will have a carbon dioxide eating machine that actually works, or some other miracle of geoengineering is going to save us, or like 3 volcanoes in a row buy us 10 years with their cloud of particles to really get serious and let some of the coal plants now being built reach their natural age and be shut down and replaced by something better. You can have those hopes, but they're not very realistic. And I know what gets me out of bed in the morning is smaller hopes, because the climate thing, it really is existential. It is. It's like you're facing a death that's larger than your own. It's like your own death written onto civilization and even the planet itself. But most of us managed to go on living in spite of that. And one of the ways we do that is we take care of what we love. And I think, even though you may not have a lot of hope for the state of affairs in 2050, there are a lot of things you might love right now that you can actually make things much better for in the short term. And that's really, that's how we've always lived. It's become that human condition of knowing it's all going to end personally for us has been written onto something larger. So really the same methods apply to thinking about the future there as thinking about one's own future.
Bill or Betsy, how do you keep hope, balance?
I think, people have faced all sorts of, terrible times and terrible problems, and somehow we're all still here. There are, actually more of us than ever before, which I guess is a testament to the, triumph of hope over experience. But we go forward, in the hopes that, somehow in our own, small and modest way, we are trying to contribute to something that I don't want to call a solution, because climate change, unfortunately, going back to the inertia of the system, is a problem that cannot be simply solved, but it can be ameliorated, and it can eventually be solved several lifetimes from now. So I think that, I don't want to say, I've never been accused of being a terribly optimistic person, but I get up every there are still many beautiful, wonderful things in the world, and we've all got to try, for the sake of our kids and other people's kids and all of the other species with whom we share this planet. I should put in a word for them, because they cannot speak for themselves. And climate change is going to drive a lot of them, countless, to the brink, already is, that we got to do the best we can. And that's what, that's what keeps me going.
Well, and I am cheered by the rapid growth in the movement of people who want to do something about this. And, despite what people were saying earlier, most of that growth and most of that movement leadership, I think now around the world and increasingly in the U.S., is coming from people on the front lines of this fight. And it's coming especially more and more and more. Some of the most important leadership everywhere is coming from indigenous communities around the world, which I just find really fun to work together with and try and figure out how to take this idea of environmental justice and take it as seriously and make it as real as we possibly can. I think that's the thing that makes the Green New Deal stuff exciting, but just watching that movement build. The young people from the Sunrise Movement who got who came up with the Green New Deal, these were mostly people who cut their teeth in college doing campus divestment over the last 5 or 6 years. And then they emerged from college and wanted to keep working, so they took up this Green New Deal fight. And now, they've got young people in Washington like AOC on board, but they just won one of the great fun elections of all time over the summer when Joe Kennedy, up by 17 points in Betsy's state when the campaign began, lost by 10 points to old Ed Markey because young people got behind him and said, his guy is the vehicle for the Green New Deal and we are going to make this happen. And things like that give me a certain amount of courage. I always reflect on the number of people who are fighting this fight all over the world in places that did nothing to cause the problem. If they can get up in the morning and work on it, then the rest of us can too, it seems to me.
I completely agree. Brad writes in that today accepted climate change is a reliable conservation killer. Do you know any good climate change icebreakers or how you engage deniers or those who don't want to hear it?
Yeah.
It's climate change jokes.
You're all funny. All your books are all, as as dark as they may be. There's also lots of wit.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there's a certain innate comedy to when you're talking about gigatons of carbon and someone says, a really good thing to do is support your local farmers market. Well, there are a lot of reasons to support your local farmers market, but reducing the gigatonnage is not one of them. So if someone knows a really good climate joke to break the ice with, please write in, or Betsy or Bill tell it to me.
Yeah, write in and I'll distribute.
Well, let me just say, there's a certain point, there's no possible way of converting the last 20 or 30% of climate deniers because it's not based around anything other than ideology. And if you spent the last, 3 decades marinating in Rush Limbaugh, that's how you'd think too, So the problem is not take that 30% and somehow convert them. It's to take the 70% who know that there's a problem and get some real part of them working on things that count. And here I think John is exactly right. It's a very good idea to go to the farmer's market. I'm glad I've got solar panels all over the roof. But we're not going to solve climate change at this point, one Prius at a time. It's going to take people coming together to make real shifts in our economic and political ground rules. And that's why it seems to me always that the most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and instead join together with others in those movements. 350.org, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for the Future, whatever it is, find a way to get together with people in a way that gives yourself enough agency, enough power, because you're combined with others, to really make a plausible difference in how much carbon is going into the atmosphere.
Okay, Mona Leitorno writes in asking, how can we inform and inspire current and rising generations of committed, invested environmental advocates and scientists without daunting their spirit? I mean, I think, Bill, this kind of ties into what you were saying.
Yeah, that one's for you, Bill.
I mean, I think because for me, this is a two-pronged problem. I think, and we've spent most of the hour talking about the human effects of climate change, but and as the environmental issue, I think we have a twin environmental issue. Betsy has covered it better than anyone else has. We're facing an absolute collapse in biodiversity. And I think, the connection I want to see made is between a concern about climate change and a concern about the natural systems of the planet. And the way you do that is how you inspire. I think you take people out to a wild place and let them be around plants and animals that are living their lives.
Yeah. It's a way to also remind you why you're fighting, right? Be out in the
Well,
natural world.
it gives you something concrete to fight for, too.
Okay, we have one more question from Dan Henling. Just 5 days ago, he writes, Michael Mann, the leading climate scientist, said that recent research shows that the actual lag between halting CO2 emissions and halting temperature rise is not 25 to 30 years, but more like 3 to 5 years. How helpful is this discovery?
Well, I mean, when we get to question of, sorry, Bill, do you want to go ahead?
No, I was just going to say it is helpful. It's still, people should be, Mike was pretty clear that there's still a lot of science to be done here, but it does look like there's reason to think that if we moved, nature might meet us a little more quickly than we'd been thinking before. So it is good news.
But I do also want to say when we talk about halting emissions, we're really talking about getting to zero. And let's just say we have a long way to go. We have about 40 billion tons, once again pre-COVID, to get rid of. So the short answer is just let's get going. That's always been the short answer. We can fight a lot about a lot of questions, which include economic questions, include geophysical questions. But I think everyone who would look at this question would say, look, we certainly have the tools to make a big difference, a significant difference. And we certainly, even if we don't know how to get exactly to zero, and even if we don't know exactly what the impacts of getting to zero are, we have the tools to get a long, long, and we need to see them yesterday, and at best was yesterday, and the next best is tomorrow. And that brings us, straight back to the election. Where are we going to be in a couple months? And we're all very, very nervously waiting to find that out.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think that's it for us. Thank you, John, Betsy, and Bill, for joining me today. And of course, my sincere thanks to all of you around the world for streaming us into your homes. And on behalf of all of us, we hope you have a great weekend.